desperation. It's a curious thing, isn't it? The more frantically we chase something, the faster it seems to slip through our fingers like sand. And nowhere is this cruel paradox more evident than when we find ourselves pursuing someone whose very nature compels them to retreat. Today, we're going to explore a fundamental truth that will save you years of heartache. Why chasing an avoidant always backfires, every time. Not sometimes, not depending on the circumstances, but with the mathematical certainty of gravity itself. Picture this scene, if you will. You've just had what you believed was a wonderful evening with someone. The conversation flowed like wine. There were moments of genuine connection, perhaps even a spark that seemed to ignite something magical between you. Then, quite suddenly, they become distant. Messages go unanswered. Plans become vague. The warmth you felt has been replaced by an Arctic chill that leaves you bewildered and inevitably desperate for answers. Your instinct, perfectly natural and utterly human, whispers seductive lies into your ear. Try harder, it says. Show them how much you care. Prove your worth. Be more available, more accommodating, more everything. And so begins the dance of the damned, a choreographed disaster where your every step forward triggers their step backward, where your increasing intensity becomes the very poison that kills what you're trying to save. But here's what makes this particularly insidious: our minds, those remarkable organs that have served us so well in countless other endeavors, become our greatest enemies in this pursuit. They employ what psychologists call outcome bias and confirmation bias, twin demons that conspire to keep us trapped in cycles of futile pursuit. Outcome bias convinces us that because we've seen one person win over an avoidant partner, the strategy must work. Confirmation bias ensures we notice every tiny sign that might suggest our efforts are working, while conveniently ignoring the mountain of evidence suggesting they're not. We become like moths drawn to flame, except the flame keeps moving further away, and we convince ourselves that we're simply not flying fast enough, not burning brightly enough, not trying hard enough. We interpret their momentary responses to our pursuit as validation of our strategy rather than what they actually are: brief, uncomfortable acknowledgements before they retreat even further into their protective shells. The tragedy isn't just that this approach fails, it's that it creates the exact opposite of what we desire. Where we seek closeness, we create distance. Where we hope to build trust, we manufacture anxiety. Where we dream of love, we architect resentment, both in them and ultimately in ourselves. Today, we'll journey together through the labyrinthine psychology of avoidant attachment, exploring why these individuals aren't playing hard to get, but are genuinely terrified of being got at all. We'll examine the cruel mechanics of pursuit and how it activates their deepest fears, transforming you from a potential sanctuary into a perceived threat. More importantly, we'll discover what actually works, not manipulation or strategy, but a profound understanding of human nature that serves both your well-being and theirs. This isn't merely about romantic relationships, though that's where the pain often cuts deepest. These patterns echo through friendships, family dynamics, and professional relationships. Understanding them is understanding a fundamental aspect of human nature that will serve you for the rest of your life. The wisdom we'll uncover today has the power to transform not just how you relate to avoidant individuals, but how you understand the very nature of attraction, connection, and authentic love itself. Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect who possessed an almost supernatural ability to design buildings that made people feel safe and welcome. Curious, isn't it, how our professional gifts sometimes mock our personal struggles? Marcus met Sarah at a gallery opening, one of those perfectly curated events where meaningful glances are exchanged over glasses of wine that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Sarah was magnetic in the way that dangerous things often are. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had traveled extensively, loved deeply, and learned to protect herself even more deeply. Their initial conversations crackled with intellectual electricity. She would lean in when he spoke about sustainable architecture, her eyes lighting up as he described buildings that breathed with their environments rather than fighting against them. For 3 weeks, they existed in that golden bubble that forms around new connections, dinners that stretched until restaurants closed around them, long walks through the city where every corner seemed to hold a new discovery, conversations that felt like coming home. Then, as suddenly as morning fog lifts, Sarah began to evaporate from his life. The woman who had enthusiastically made plans for a weekend getaway suddenly became uncertain about her schedule. Text messages that once arrived within minutes now took hours, then days. When they did meet, she seemed present but distant, like someone watching their interaction from behind glass. Marcus, being an intelligent man accustomed to solving problems through analysis and effort, did what seemed logical. He increased his efforts. He sent thoughtful messages about articles he thought she'd enjoy. He made reservations at restaurants she had mentioned wanting to try. He offered to accompany her to events he knew mattered to her. Each gesture was met with polite appreciation, followed by increasingly creative reasons why she couldn't commit to firm plans. Here's where our twin demons entered the stage. Outcome bias whispered that his colleague David had won over his now wife through persistent romantic gestures. Surely the same approach would work here. Confirmation bias ensured that Marcus noticed every smile Sarah gave him, every moment she seemed to warm up during their increasingly rare encounters, while completely overlooking the fact that these moments were becoming islands in an ocean of avoidance. The more Marcus pursued, the more elaborate Sarah's retreat became. She began mentioning old friends she was reconnecting with, work projects that required her complete attention, a sudden interest in solo travel for self-discovery. Marcus interpreted each explanation as a challenge to overcome rather than what they actually were. The desperate constructions of someone who felt increasingly trapped by his affection. The devastating climax came during what would be their final dinner together. Marcus, exhausted by months of emotional uncertainty, decided to lay his cards on the table. He spoke eloquently about his feelings, his hopes for their relationship, his willingness to be patient while she worked through whatever was holding her back. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, and what he saw there wasn't the gratitude or relief he'd hoped for. Instead, he witnessed something that would haunt him for months afterward, a look of genuine panic, like a wild animal that suddenly realizes it's been cornered. Sarah's response was kind but devastating. She spoke about not being ready for something serious, about needing space to figure herself out, about how wonderful he was and how he deserved someone who could give him what he was looking for. Each word was carefully chosen and utterly final. The next morning, she sent a text message ending their relationship with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. What Marcus couldn't understand then, and what takes most of us years to learn, is that his pursuit hadn't failed despite his genuine care and consistent effort. It had failed because of these things. Every message declaring his interest had felt like pressure to Sarah. Every romantic gesture had registered as a demand for reciprocation she wasn't capable of providing. Every expression of his growing attachment had triggered her deepest fear that someone was becoming dependent on her for their happiness, and that she would inevitably disappoint them as she felt she had disappointed others before. The cruel irony is that Sarah did care for Marcus. In her quiet moments, she recognized his qualities and felt genuine affection for him. But caring for someone with deep, avoidant patterns often feels dangerous rather than wonderful. It represents vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like standing naked in a blizzard. The more he showed her that her presence mattered to him, the more terrified she became of the power she held to hurt him, and the certainty that she eventually would. Marcus spent months replaying their interactions, convinced that if he had just said the right thing at the right moment, or if he had been more patient, or if he had somehow proven his worth more convincingly, the outcome would have been different. This is the cruelest gift that outcome bias and confirmation bias give us, the illusion that we had control over something that was never actually in our hands. Now, before you think this story ends in tragedy, let me tell you what happened next. Marcus, after months of analysis and self-recrimination, finally sought perspective from a therapist who specialized in attachment theory. Through their work together, he began to understand that Sarah's withdrawal wasn't a reflection of his inadequacy, but a manifestation of her own deep-seated fears about intimacy and connection. More importantly, he learned something that changed how he approached all his relationships going forward. He discovered that the very qualities that made him an excellent architect, his persistence, his attention to detail, his unwillingness to give up on challenging projects, could become liabilities when applied to human relationships. Buildings don't retreat when you work on them more intensively. People do. Armed with this new understanding, Marcus began to approach relationships with what his therapist called relaxed confidence. Instead of pursuing, he practiced presence. Instead of trying to prove his worth, he simply offered his authentic self without attachment to the outcome. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. Within a year, he met Rebecca, someone who could match his emotional availability and who saw his consistency as a gift rather than a threat. And Sarah? Marcus learned through mutual friends that she had begun working with her own therapist, slowly examining the patterns that kept her isolated despite her longing for connection. Understanding that her avoidance wasn't a character flaw, but a learned protection strategy, was the beginning of her own journey toward healthier relationships. So, what can we extract from this modern tragedy that became a story of growth? The first and most crucial insight is this. When dealing with avoidant individuals, your instincts will lie to you with breathtaking consistency. Everything that feels like it should work, increased attention, explicit declarations of interest, persistent effort to connect, will have the opposite effect of what you intend. Let's begin with the foundational principle. Create space rather than filling it. This isn't about playing games or employing manipulation tactics. It's about understanding that avoidant individuals need room to breathe emotionally. When you step back, you're not abandoning them or showing disinterest. You're providing the psychological space they need to process their own feelings without the added pressure of managing yours. Think of it this way. Imagine trying to observe a timid forest animal. The closer you get, the more likely it is to flee. But if you sit quietly at a comfortable distance, remaining present but undemanding, you create the conditions where the animal might choose to approach you. This isn't about patience as a strategic tool to get what you want. That energy will be felt and will backfire just as surely as direct pursuit. This is about genuine respect for another person's emotional rhythms and boundaries. The second principle involves what I call emotional non-attachment, though this term often gets misunderstood. This doesn't mean becoming cold or indifferent. Rather, it means maintaining your own emotional equilibrium regardless of their responses or lack thereof. When you're emotionally attached to specific outcomes, needing them to text back within a certain time frame, requiring particular expressions of interest, depending on their validation for your sense of worth, you create an energetic desperation that avoidant individuals can sense from miles away. Developing emotional non-attachment requires rigorous self-honesty about your own motivations and needs. Ask yourself, am I interested in this person because of who they actually are, or because of the challenge they represent? Am I drawn to their authentic qualities, or to the fantasy of being the one who finally breaks through their walls? These questions cut to the bone, but answering them honestly is essential for breaking the cycle of futile pursuit. The third principle is perhaps the most difficult to implement. Focus relentlessly on your own life and growth. Avoidant individuals are often unconsciously attracted to people who have rich, full lives independent of the relationship. This isn't because they're looking for someone to ignore them, but because they need to know that their partner won't collapse emotionally if they need space or time to process their feelings. This means developing genuine interests, maintaining friendships, pursuing goals that matter to you, and cultivating a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on any one person's response to you. When avoidant individuals sense that you have a complete life that they're invited to join, rather than an incomplete one they're expected to fulfill, the entire dynamic shifts. You become someone intriguing rather than needy, someone who adds value rather than seeks validation. The fourth principle involves mastering what therapists call secure communication. This means expressing your feelings and needs without making them the other person's responsibility to manage. Instead of saying, "I miss you so much when you don't text back," try, "I wanted to share that I've been thinking about our last conversation." Instead of, "Where do you see this relationship going?" consider, "I'm enjoying getting to know you, and I'm curious about your thoughts on how we're connecting." The difference is subtle but profound. Secure communication shares your inner world without making it a burden for the other person to carry. It expresses interest without creating pressure. It maintains your dignity while respecting their autonomy. This type of communication feels safe to avoidant individuals because it doesn't trigger their core fear of being responsible for someone else's emotional well-being. The fifth, and perhaps most challenging principle, is learning to interpret avoidant behavior accurately rather than through the lens of your own attachment style. When an avoidant person becomes distant, it usually means they're processing feelings, not that they've lost interest. When they seem to pull back after moments of closeness, they're likely managing their own fear of vulnerability, not rejecting you personally. This requires developing what I call emotional translation skills. Their need for space becomes information about their internal process rather than evidence of your inadequacy. Their difficulty with consistent communication becomes data about their comfort level with intimacy rather than proof that they don't care. This shift in interpretation is crucial because it allows you to respond to what's actually happening rather than to your fears about what might be happening. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. What if nothing works? What if understanding their attachment style, giving them space, focusing on your own life, and communicating securely still doesn't result in the relationship you desire? This brings us to the sixth and most important principle. Acceptance of what is rather than attachment to what could be. Sometimes, despite perfect understanding and flawless execution, two people simply aren't compatible. Sometimes an avoidant person's fear of intimacy runs so deep that no amount of patient, secure behavior can bridge the gap. Sometimes the timing is wrong, or the circumstances aren't right, or 1,000 other factors beyond your control determine the outcome. This is where true wisdom lies, in recognizing that your worth as a person and your capacity for love aren't determined by any one person's ability to receive what you're offering. The goal isn't to become so skilled at managing avoidant individuals that you can guarantee specific outcomes. The goal is to become so secure in yourself that you can offer authentic connection without losing yourself when that connection isn't reciprocated in the way you hope. Remember Marcus from our earlier story. His transformation wasn't complete when he learned to give Sarah space. It was complete when he realized that her inability to receive his love said nothing about the value of his love itself. The techniques and principles we've discussed aren't manipulation tactics designed to get avoidant people to change. They're wisdom practices that help you become the kind of person who can love freely without losing yourself in the process. So here we are at the end of our journey through the complex landscape of avoidant attachment and the futility of pursuit. If you've stayed with me this far, you've already demonstrated something crucial: the patience and commitment to understanding that characterizes people capable of genuine love. The truth we've uncovered today is both simple and profound. Chasing an avoidant always backfires because pursuit triggers their deepest fears while compromising your own dignity and emotional well-being. But the deeper truth is that learning to love without chasing transforms you into someone capable of attracting and maintaining the kind of love you actually want. Every principle we've discussed, creating space, developing emotional non-attachment, focusing on your own growth, communicating securely, interpreting behavior accurately, and accepting what is, serves a dual purpose. Yes, these approaches are more likely to create conditions where an avoidant person might feel safe enough to move toward connection. But more importantly, they develop you into someone who doesn't need another person's validation to feel whole. This is the great paradox of relationships. The less you need someone, the more attractive you become to them. The more complete you are on your own, the more you have to offer in partnership. The more secure you become in yourself, the safer you feel to others who struggle with their own insecurities about love and connection. I want you to imagine yourself 6 months from now, having internalized these principles. Picture yourself in interactions with people, not just potentially romantic partners, but friends, colleagues, family members, approaching each relationship from a place of curious interest rather than anxious need. See yourself offering your authentic self without attachment to how that offering is received. Visualize the freedom that comes from knowing your worth isn't determined by any one person's ability to recognize it. This isn't just about improving your chances with avoidant individuals, though it will do that. This is about becoming someone who attracts secure, healthy people who can meet your emotional availability with their own. This is about breaking cycles of pursuit and withdrawal that may have characterized your relationships for years. This is about discovering what it feels like to love from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. Your assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to begin today. Choose one principle from our discussion and commit to practicing it in your current relationships. If you're actively interested in someone who seems avoidant, resist the urge to send that extra text or make that additional gesture of interest. Instead, focus that energy on something in your own life that brings you joy or growth. If you're between relationships, use this time to develop the internal security that will serve you in future connections. Explore your own attachment patterns. Examine the difference between being interested in someone and being attached to specific outcomes with them. Practice the kind of self-love that makes you irresistible to people capable of loving you back. Remember, every moment you spend chasing someone who's running away is a moment not spent being available for someone who's running toward you. Every ounce of energy you invest in trying to convince someone of your worth is energy not invested in activities and relationships that celebrate that worth naturally. The world needs people who understand how to love without losing themselves. It needs individuals who can offer connection without demanding it, who can be present without being possessive, who can care deeply without caring desperately. Today, you've taken a crucial step toward becoming one of those people. The question now isn't whether you can attract an avoidant person. It's whether you'll become so secure in yourself that their avoidance becomes irrelevant to your happiness. That, my friends, is where true freedom lies. Not in getting what you want from people who can't give it, but in becoming someone who naturally attracts what you need from people who can.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.